Everything working okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. I'm Dana Schoaf, Director of Interpretation, and I'm going to get selfish for just a little bit because yesterday was my one-year anniversary here at the museum. So I made it a year, and I didn't get, let go. So that's always exciting, right? Well, thank you for coming in. And I wanted to introduce our fabulous speaker today, who will be Jonathan Noyles. Jonathan is the director of Shenandoah University's McCormick Civil War Institute. Have any of you heard of that? Very active institute that offers a seminar. When is your spring seminar?
April 26th.
April 26th. If you get a chance, look online and you can find out information about the seminar that they're offering at the McCormick Institute. They always do great stuff. I actually will be speaking at that, which I'm very pleased to mention. He's also a history professor there at Shenandoah University, and he's the author or editor of 16 books, including most recently The Blood-Tinted Waters of the Shenandoah, which is relative to his talk today, and has published more than 100 articles, chapters, essays, and reviews in his various scholarly and popular publications. In addition to teaching and writing, Jonathan has consulted on various public history projects with organizations such as the National Park Service, the American Battlefield Trust, the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields National Historic District. Professor Noyles frequently speaks to public audience and has appeared on C-SPAN's American History TV, PCN, which is the Pennsylvania Cable Network, and NPR's With Good Reason. He is a recipient of numerous awards for his scholarship and teaching, including Shenandoah University's Exemplary Teaching Award for the first year seminar, Shenandoah's Wilkins Award for Distinguished Service to the University, and the State Council for Higher Education in Virginia's Outstanding Faculty Award. So he's a numerous award recipient. He is also an active participant and has been for some time in the North-South Skirmish Association. So he enjoys shooting muskets as well in their biannual competitions at Fort Shenandoah near Winchester, which is a neat place. I saw Jonathan, I'm just a little embarrassing, I saw him here a couple years ago struggling to get his Spencer rifle to work, which can be cantankerous. And I just asked him, did you ever get the Spencer fixed? And he said, no, it's dead to me. So he's a little frustrated with that firearm. So he's going to be talking about the Battle of Cool Spring. And even though Frederick, is relatively far north in the Eastern Theater, you're all well aware a lot of Civil War action crisscrossed this area. And in 1864, Jubal Early will swing up on his raid into Frederick and engage and instigate the Battle of Monocacy, after which Early will then move and threaten Washington, D.C. And when he cannot get into the environs of D.C., he will retreat back into the Shenandoah Valley, and that will precipitate the Battle of Cool Spring, which is the subject of Jonathan's talk, A Day Never to Be Forgotten, what the Battle of Cool Spring reveals about the war's impact on soldiers and families. So come on up here, Jonathan.
Thank you, John.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is a beautiful, bright, sunny day. Welcome to all of you here and online. Fair warning, you might end up becoming a little bit sad and dejected by the end of my remarks this afternoon. So this is not a happy lecture, but nonetheless important. So for the final 34 years of this man's life, Colonel James Washburn, the commander of the 116th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, there was not a single day that passed that he did not think about July 18, 1864, which is the date of the Battle of Cool Spring. So Colonel Washburn did not think about this battle, which was fought east of Berryville, Virginia, along the banks of the Shenandoah River in Clark County. He did not think about this battle because this was the battle that marked the end of the Union pursuit led by General Horatio Wright from the gates of Washington to the banks of the Shenandoah in Clark County. And basically that area there on the map in red, that's where the Battle of Cool Spring was fought on the 18th of July. So he doesn't think about this battle a great deal because it marks the end of that pursuit. In fact, when you think about the Battle of Cool Spring, it wasn't even a remarkable engagement in terms of like strategic outcomes or tactical outcomes. When you look at the aftermath of this battle, Assistant Secretary of War Charles Dana, he labeled the fight along the banks of the Shenandoah, and I'm quoting now, as achieving nothing of any great importance. And he said it achieved nothing of any great importance because it didn't do what President Lincoln wanted that pursuit to do. President Lincoln wanted Horatio Wright to crush Jubal Early, the Confederate commander who had gotten to the northern boundary of Washington, D.C. So the question becomes, if this battle isn't remembered by this guy because of any great strategic outcome, any political outcome, why does this battle dominate his existence? Why is this a day that is so significant to him? Well, here's the answer. This day is so significant for the remaining 34 years of his life because of how this battle altered him physically. So, as the Battle of Cool Spring unfolded on the afternoon of July 18, 1864, and I'll just sort of give you fair warning here, I'm not going to give you a traditional battle talk. I mean, I did write a book about the battle, and it's downstairs, I believe, for sale in the gift shop, and I'm happy to sign copies afterwards. But when this battle begins on the afternoon of July 18th, the ultimate goal is for Colonel Joseph Thoburn, who was commanding about 5,000 Union soldiers that day, a part of this large Union pursuit force of about 30,000 men. The goal actually was to cross the Shenandoah River north of the Confederate position and then turn south and flank. Well, basically, before he has an opportunity to do that, Colonel Thoburn's command is attacked by General Gabriel Wharton's division. Now, as I tell people every time they come out to the Cool Spring battlefield for a tour with me, and by the way, Shenandoah University owns 195 acres of the Cool Spring battlefield. That's open every single day from sunup until sundown for the people to come out and tour and take in rather what I think is a breathtaking landscape. What I tell people when they come out to Cool Spring is that Gabriel Wharton's attack is not the main attraction, it's the main distraction. So about a half hour after the battle begins, so we're looking at around 5:30 in the evening of July 18th, Robert Rhodes' division attacks the far northern end of Thoburn's line. And it's at that moment in time that Thoburn begins to realize that's where the pressure is going to be. And so he starts shuffling troops from the far southern end to the far northern end of the line. Well, one of those regiments that is sent from down there to up there is Colonel Washburn's 116th Ohio. At the moment Washburn's command reached that far north end, a bullet, presumably fired by a soldier in Colonel Samuel Pickens's Alabama Brigade, it struck Washburn in the left eye. So it pierced his left eye. The bullet actually exited out behind his right ear. So immediately when Colonel Washburn fell, men in the regiment got him off of the battlefield as quickly as possible. So I'm going to pull the mic here so I can point. So he's wounded up here. He's pulled back across to this side of the Shenandoah River, and this whole piece of property right here is what is owned today by Shenandoah University. So when they brought him to that east side of the river, doctors there looked at him, they examined him very, very quickly, and they gave him a rather ominous prognosis. No hope of recovery. There is no one who wants to hear that. So you have this great sense of sadness among the men in the 116th Ohio. There are accounts of, the guys who carry him across the river, bawling their eyes out. Because he was not only a commander to these guys, he was, to many of them, a father figure. But what is remarkable about this is Colonel Washburn, he beat the odds and he survived. So he was stabilized on the battlefield. He was then taken to Harper's Ferry. He spent a few months receiving medical care at Harper's Ferry. And then by late October of 1864 was actually back with the regiment. It's remarkable. But even though he survives this wound, even though his life was spared, every time he looked in the mirror, he saw that disfigured face with one eye, that disfigured face staring back at him. Every single day, he endured excruciating amounts of pain and agony. I can't imagine what it would be like to get shot through the head and survive the pain you have to deal with. So that disfigured face staring back at him, that pain, they were his constant daily companions. Those were the things that remind him every day of the important role that the Battle of Cool Spring and July 18th, 1864 played in his life. When I think about Colonel Washburn's story, his story of wounding and survival, I think it serves as a very powerful reminder that even though Cool Spring is one of the war's lesser known engagements, to the men who fought at Cool Spring, to the soldiers who were wounded during the battle, to soldiers who were impacted in some way psychologically by what they had experienced or witnessed on the field, to the wives transformed into widows, to the children made fatherless, Cool Spring was the Civil War's most significant engagement. You know, I think sometimes when we study a battle, we focus too much on this, the blue blocks and the red blocks and the arrows and the movements. I'm not saying that that's not important. It is. Like, you can't understand a battle without looking at those types of things. But sometimes I feel that we lose sight of the reality that this isn't a game. That contained within these blocks, at least on this map, are the lives of 13,000 human beings, many of whom are the age of the students I teach at Shenandoah. People in their late teenage years, early 20s, who have so much hope and so much potential, and they have all these plans, and they're cut short in an instant because of what happens on seemingly some obscure battlefield in the eastern part of Clark County, Virginia. Now, by the time the sun set on July 18th, there were more than 800 Union and Confederate soldiers killed or wounded. Among them was Sergeant David Terry of the 123rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. So that night, once darkness descended over the battlefield, Colonel Thoburn gave the order to withdraw. And as the men were preparing to withdraw, Colonel Thoburn sent orders up and down the line. I want you to evacuate as many of the wounded as possible. He knew that they weren't going to be able to get everyone out. But let's try to get as many out as we possibly can. So there were two soldiers in the 123rd Ohio who were looking out about 10 yards beyond the main Union line, which hugs the bank of the Shenandoah River. And they saw their comrade, Sergeant David Terry, writhing in agony. He was actually stuck in the corner of a fence. He had a severe wound to the left side of his chest. And so these two unidentified Buckeyes, they go out, they get him out from that fence post, they bring him to the riverbank, they put him on a blanket, and they prepare to evacuate him. So these two Buckeyes who are carrying Sergeant Terry, they have to navigate not only the river, but an island that sits in the middle of the river. So just out of curiosity, aside from Dana and my wife and son, have any of you been out to Cool Spring before? A couple of you have? Good. So you know that Parker's Island and Parker's Island South, they dominate this part of the river. And so they get Sergeant Terry to Parker's Island, and he is in such agony and pain, he asks these two comrades just simply, put me down and leave me here. And I think he also does it not because he is in such pain and agony, but I think he also does it because he recognizes that these guys are being slowed in their own withdrawal from the battlefield. He realizes that his fate is going to be death in the very near future, and so why risk the lives of two fellow comrades? And so they put him down on that island and they leave him there. Well, it was at some point between the night of July 18th and the afternoon of July 20th that Sergeant Terry passed away. And so after, the afternoon of July 20th, what ends up happening is Jubal Early withdrew from the battlefield because he had received information that another Union force, commanded by General William Avril, was moving from Martinsburg south to Winchester. And Jubal Early didn't want to basically get stuck in between the Federals in Winchester and the Federals along the banks of the Shenandoah, so he withdrew. And when he withdrew, then the rest of the Union Army, they crossed back over, and they were looking for the wounded. And so when comrades from the 123rd Ohio got to Parker's Island, they were looking for Sergeant Terry. They were holding out hope that maybe he survived. Well, of course, he didn't. They found his lifeless body, and then they started looking for his personal possessions. They knew he carried on him things like photographs of his wife and two children, Joseph and Lycurgus. They knew that he had, cherished these letters that he had received from his wife, Mary Ann. Where were these things? And so they couldn't find them anywhere on his body. And they thought, well, this is odd. They knew that the Confederates weren't on Parker's Island. And so they started searching around a little bit and ultimately found them hidden under a log. And once they found those things hidden under a log, they realized that even though they didn't have anything in writing from Sergeant Terry, they knew what he was thinking about in his final moments. They knew that in his final moments, he was thinking about two things. He was thinking about his wife and two children, and he was thinking about, I don't want the most cherished personal possessions I have to fall into the hands of the enemy. And this is what Lieutenant Charles Keyes of that regiment, he ultimately becomes the regimental historian. This is what he wrote, I think very powerfully, of those final moments of Sergeant Terry's life. Knowing his hours were few, lying there alone, dying with only God's angels watching over him, his last thoughts were of dear ones at home, secreting his effects, hoping them to fall into the hands of his friends, that his wife and babies might receive this, his last dying gift, with the sad murmurings of the Shenandoah chanting its endless requiem. So once his body was discovered, Captain John Chamberlain of Company A, who was a really good friend of Sergeant Terry, he gave orders to have Sergeant Terry wrapped in a blanket and buried on Parker's Island. I would bet that his remains are still there. He then, after he gave that order, he gathered up all of those personal belongings. He took a lock of his hair that he had taken before the men buried him, and then he pulled out a piece of paper and he performed the solemn task that so many officers on both sides had to perform throughout the course of the war. Write a letter now to the widow and let him know, or let her know, what happened to her husband. So Chamberlain, he starts writing this letter in a way that is pretty typical. So if you look at this right here, this is the first page of a 4-page letter he ends up writing to Mary Ann Terry. And in the letter, he discusses, his great commitment to the regiment, devotion to duty, his patriotism, all those types of typical things that you would see an officer write. And he wrote in part, "Thus has another brave soldier gone to his rest. There never was a braver or truer soldier than your husband. In camp, he always knew his duty and performed it well. In time of action, he was always cool and collected, foremost in daring, and knew no such thing as fear. He was well known throughout the regiment and highly respected by both officers and men. And Chamberlain had written similar letters like this throughout the war. But then there's a moment where you can see it when you read this letter, where he basically pauses and he thinks about the words that he's writing, and he thinks about what ultimately is the value, what is the weight of my words. Because he writes in the letter, we express our deep sympathy, we send you our thoughts. And you think about our own existence, right? Something terrible happens, someone passes away, and we send them a card. What does that really mean? And Captain Chamberlain gets to a point in the letter, he's like, we all sympathize with you in this, your deep affliction, but human sympathy avails little. I think the horror, the tragedy, the heartache that Mary Ann Terry feels when she opens up this letter and reads it on the family farm in Marion County, Ohio, that this is a feeling of sadness and despair that approximately 200,000 women feel during the war, North and South. That is the total number of women who are transformed into widows as a result of the Civil War, North and South. Now, for someone like Mary Ann Terry, there was no funeral, there was no grave to visit, there's no closure. Think about the loss of loved ones in your own life. How often do you go to a cemetery and visit that grave? My father passed away back in 2018. Every time I'm back in Frackville, Pennsylvania, I visit his grave and leave something there. Mary Ann Terry and her sons, Joseph and Lycurgus, they don't have that opportunity. And her example can be multiplied exponentially because there are thousands and thousands and thousands of families who are in that same circumstance. So after she received this very tragic news, Mary Ann Terry did what hundreds of thousands of widows in the North did during the war. She applied for a pension. And so by the summer of 1864, the federal government had, for the past 2 years, had a new series of regulations in place that awarded pensions to widows and orphans. So not to get into too much of the weeds here, but it was a graduated scale. So for a private corporal, sergeant, or musician, the widow would get $8 a month. And the scale goes all the way up to $30, lieutenant colonel and above. And the federal government, there was a lot of debate in Congress about this, but basically the federal government thought, the Congress thought, that the higher the risk, or the higher the rank, the higher the risk. And so therefore the widows deserve more. They also stipulated that as part of this process of receiving a pension, you could apply for additional funds for your children. Now, regardless of the rank, each child received $2. So when she files her claim for a widow's pension, she's filing a claim for $12. And ultimately, about 2.5 months after the battle, she ends up receiving her claim. And so this here is one of the many pages in the widow pension file for Mary Ann Terry. There is no amount of money, right, that can replace a human life. But what this does is it takes a little bit of the sting out of Mary Ann Terry trying to figure out, how do I make ends meet? How do I run the family farm? How do I care for my children? And again, you have to remember, so if you look at, women's employment in the 1860s, I'm just going to throw this out here for a question to the audience, so I'll play professor this Saturday afternoon. What percentage of women do you think in 1864 had a job?
10%.
We here have 10, we have 8. It's about 1.8%. all right? It's really low. Mary Ann Terry doesn't have a job. She doesn't have employment, so she needs this money to help. Now, for her, she was able to make ends meet. But there were some individuals, some people who become widowed, it's simply not enough. So one of the other soldiers who ends up being killed at the Battle of Cool Spring, Private James Burns of the 5th New York Heavy Artillery. There's a lot of parallels between Burns and Terry. So when Burns's widow, Margaret, received word about what happened to her husband, she applied for a pension. It was her and 2 children, and ultimately she ends up receiving $12 a month. But here's the sad part for her. It wasn't enough to make ends meet. And so she could not afford to keep her children. Any of you want to guess what she did with her kids?
Put them up in front of the church and say, who can take them?
She gave them away.
Yeah.
She actually gave them away to a family friend. And so the story of the Burns family, this sadly is repeated hundreds of times over, north and south. Now, while Sergeant Terry spent his final moments in agony on Parker's Island that night of the 18th and then over the course of the next few days, you have this man right here, Captain Kerry Whitaker of the 43rd North Carolina. He is going over the battlefield that night, and he is looking for not only wounded men from his regiment, but he's looking for one person in particular. This guy right here, Lieutenant William Bevins. So Kerry Whitaker and Billy Bevins were cousins, and they also were really good friends. Billy Bevins, at some point during one of the multiple assaults that Robert Rhodes led against the far northern end of Thoburn's line, received a pretty severe wound to his right leg. And Whitaker wanted to know, did he survive? So Whitaker ends up finding him on the battlefield, ends up, helping him get to Robert Rhodes' division field hospital. Doctors tend to him there, and they realize, as this museum attests, that the only recourse for such a severe damage to that leg is amputation. What's remarkable to me about Billy Bevins' story is that you have a moment, you have something that he leaves behind that allows you to see the pain that he is in. So you can read about this, you can see this in exhibitions. Soldier gets shot, soldier is in pain, leg is amputated, and we assume that this would hurt, this would be painful. But this right here allows you to see it. So this is a page from Billy Bevins' diary. You can notice right up here at the top, Monday, July 18th, 1864. And so you look at some of the initial lines in this diary page, and the lines are nice and neat and straight, and the handwriting is really easy to read, and then it changes dramatically. Well, what he is writing about here, and I think this is remarkable, he is writing about the process of being examined, having his leg amputated, and then being sent to Winchester. His leg was amputated, by the way, without anesthesia. And we know that anesthesia, of course, was used more often than not in surgeries. But the Confederates don't have it at Cool Spring. And so you're able to see the pain that he is in on this page. I could just imagine him there, agonizing and just, pressing as hard as possible onto that paper to record his thoughts. Well, late that night, while Bevins was going through his ordeal, Kerry Whitaker was having a moment of self-reflection, really. Because Kerry Whitaker felt a range of emotions. On one hand, he was very sad for Billy Bevins, that he was having to go through this very terrible pain and trauma and tragedy. But on another hand, he was actually envious, because that wound was going to send him home. This was going to take him out of the war. It was going to allow him to return to civilian life. And again, these guys had been enlisted in North Carolina units since the spring of 1861. And this is what Cary Whittaker wrote in his diary that night. I am so very sorry to hear this. So hard for a fine-looking man in the bloom of his youth to be mutilated in this way. One consolation is that it might have been worse, that he is now out of the war. The loss of a leg may be the saving of his life. You start to see, if you kind of read between the lines a little bit, and then you look at some of Whittaker's other diary entries, he's kind of done. He's exhausted. He wants to go home. Well, sadly, he is never going to have an opportunity to go home. He was shot in both of his hands at Petersburg on April 2nd, 1865. He was evacuated to a hospital in Danville, Virginia. He died there 17 days later. But Cary Whittaker wasn't the only one to be envious of Billy Bevins's wounds. Second Lieutenant George Whittaker Wills, also of that 43rd North Carolina, who incidentally was killed at the Third Battle of Winchester. I told you this is a real downer of a lecture. But this is what he wrote in his diary. Bevins will be clear of the war, and that is a consideration, since men's lives are not now insured from one day to another, and he, though with one leg, is probably better off than any of us with two. But Bevins would not be better off. Bevins died on July 31st, 1864 at the York Hospital in Winchester, and was eventually buried in what becomes Stonewall Confederate Cemetery in Winchester, and there is Billy Bevins's tombstone. Now, while Bevins's end and Terry's end and Burns's end all come as a result of, the typical types of things you would see on a battlefield, soldiers shooting at each other, it's important to understand that, and I think the Battle of Cool Spring offers some really powerful reminders of this, that there are other things that soldiers encounter on the battlefield that can make them casualties and end their existence. So when the Union Army crossed the Shenandoah River on the afternoon of July 18th, so to kind of orient you, and if you've been there, you know this, but this is the eastern side of the river. This is looking across to the western shore where the Union line is hugging the banks of the Shenandoah. The Shenandoah River in the summer of 1864 was really, really low. It was a terrible drought in this part of the Shenandoah Valley. And so based on the accounts of most soldiers, the water was coming up to the knee or to the mid-thigh, and you would think that it's really easy to cross. I mean, there is a ford here. It's called Island Ford, but you really don't need a ford to cross. You can just walk across. But even though it seemed like it would be a really easy place to cross without any difficulty whatsoever, the reality is there are examples that exist of soldiers becoming casualties as a result of Mother Nature. And I think it's important to understand that soldiers on both sides, they have each other as the enemy, so Union versus Confederate and vice versa, and then they have an enemy that knows no allegiance, and that's Mother Nature. Mother Nature doesn't care whose side you're on. Mother Nature is unforgiving. So as the Federals were crossing that day, Private John Gundy of the 170th Ohio, this is his first battle. It's actually the only battle for the 170th. As they were crossing, his left leg got stuck in something. And if you look at this photograph right here that I took about a year or so ago, there's all kind of stuff lurking in the bottom of the Shenandoah River. And so he gets his leg stuck, and he's trying to get it out, and he can't. It's wedged in there. So a few of his comrades come over, help pull his left leg out. Well, they release the leg, but in the process, they rupture his left groin. Infection sets in. And ultimately, in October of 1864, he died. So this is a page from the widow's claim for Ann Gundy, his widow. And if you look here, it notes, Snickers Landing, Virginia, and the Battle of Cool Spring, by the way, is known by many names. Snickers Ferry, Snickers Gap, Island Ford. Incidentally, it's not known as Cool Spring during the war at all. It's a post-war name that's applied. But in any event, if you look right here, it notes that when he was crossing, he ran against a snag, causing a rupture in the left groin, July 18, 1864. It attributes his cause of death to that rupture. So Mother Nature made him a casualty. So the Shenandoah River presents all kinds of challenges, particularly for Union soldiers during the battle. So here's another sad story to depress you on this beautiful Saturday afternoon. When the Union Army was retreating, and there are different moments, I should say, during the battle where pockets of Thoburn's command give way because of the force and the weight of the Confederate assaults. So as soldiers from the 18th Connecticut were retreating from the battlefield, you have these two guys right here. They are brothers, Private James Smith and Private Samuel Smith. So these guys had been in the war together since 1862, since the 18th Connecticut was organized. As they were retreating, James was in front of Samuel. A bullet from a Confederate musket struck James in the back. He falls face down into the Shenandoah River. Samuel is behind him, and he has to make a decision. Do I try to save my brother from drowning, because he didn't think that the wound was mortal? Or do I save myself so that my wife doesn't become a widow and my children become fatherless? I have a brother and can't imagine being in that kind of a situation. So ultimately, he makes the decision to leave his brother go. That he wants to spare his wife and children the misery of losing him. So needless to say, the river carries him away. He ends up drowning. A local farmer in Clark County pulls him out and buries him along the riverbank. This is something, needless to say, that haunts Samuel for the remaining months of the conflict and the remaining months of his life. In the spring of 1865, as the Civil War in Virginia, at least, is beginning to wind down, Samuel, who at this point is in Harper's Ferry, he wrote a letter to his wife and said, I am so tortured by this that I need to go back and try to find his body. And this is what he wrote his wife on April 9th. My 4 months' pay I shall keep a while, so that if there is any chance to get poor Jimmy's body, I may have some by me to work with. Remarkably, he came back. He found his brother's remains. The farmer who buried him actually put an impromptu marker in the ground. He had him disinterred and sent back to the family cemetery in East Killingly, Connecticut. But there are other examples of the Shenandoah River being an enemy, again, that knows no allegiance. So during the Union withdrawal, and again, this is happening at night for the most part, as soldiers are coming from the west side of the river to the east side, this right here is Parker's Island. They are not aware that in the midst of the area between Parker's Island and the East Bank, there is this deep, dark abyss known as Parker's Hole. And even though if you tour the battlefield, today there's a marker that notes this is Parker's Hole, you don't even need signage to tell you this is Parker's Hole. Because the Shenandoah River's waters traditionally are extremely calm, Well, here it's all dark and green and frothy, and there actually is a whirlpool action because the river at this point is about 25 to 35 feet deep from the collapse of an underground cavern. So there are Union soldiers as they're retreating thinking, okay, earlier in the day, we walked across the river, there were no issues. Well, as they step off of Parker's Island into Parker's Hole, if you're not expecting it, carrying all of your equipment, you plunge to the bottom. A number of years ago, my students and I, as well as my wife, Brandy, who's up here in the front, actually helped me go through all of these casualty records from Cool Spring. And we were able to identify 4 individuals whose specific cause of death at Cool Spring was drowning in Parker's Hole. The scene of these individuals getting caught in the current and pulled down. This was too much for this guy to take. James Noggle, who's a surgeon in Colonel Samuel Young's Provisional Brigade, which had initially guarded the far right end of the Union line. He was tormented by these scenes. He wrote about, how there were these moments in the decades after the war where he's waking up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat because he could hear that gurgling sound. He could see those heads and those hands grasping for life and then sucked down. And that's it. But other scenes, such as losing one's best friend, haunted the battle's survivors. So during one of the many attacks launched by Robert Rhodes' division at the battle, this man right here, John Alexander Steichleather, the color bearer of the 4th North Carolina, he had his 2 best friends. These are people he grew up with. Sidney Bussell and Martin Snow were killed. He survived. And I think what bothered Steichleather is not that just his 2 friends were killed. He knew that as the color bearer, he was the target. The Union infantry, their muskets were training on the colors, and they just missed. And so he has to live with this for the rest of his life. Why am I spared and why are they the ones who are killed? Decades after the war, he wrote, thinking about Martin Snow, "When I come to speak and think of Martin Snow, I feel that I am treading on sacred ground. He was my friend and I loved him like a brother. And today, I cherish his memory with a chastened pleasure known only to myself." And I think the act of writing becomes a form of therapy for soldiers. It's not just a record of what they did and what they experienced, but it's a way for them to sort things out. It's a catharsis for them. For some veterans, this was enough. For others, it was not enough. So at some point on the late afternoon of July 20th, after Early's army had withdrawn, and Horatio Wright's Union force crosses back over, and they start scouring the battlefield, Lieutenant William Byron Henry of the 116th Ohio, he was looking not only for wounded or dead from his regiment, but he was looking for one particular person. This guy right here, Private Samuel Hayes. Private Hayes was like a son to Lieutenant Henry. And so he found him. But he found him in a rather deplorable state. So to kind of set the stage here, as grisly as it is, July 20th, that evening, there was a terrible, terrible storm that tore through Clark County. There actually are multiple accounts of Union soldiers talking about seeing a tornado. John Holt, who was the surgeon of the 121st New York, he said it was a quote-unquote real ripper. Well, when you have this torrential rain, if you have graves that are really shallow, and you think about the contour of the battlefield, so the Battle of Cool Spring is not flat. It's on an incline. And so that rainwater, it's not going to take much to wash away those shallow graves. And so soldiers are coming and they're seeing, arms and legs and body parts sticking out of the ground, and it's very this sort of surreal scene. Well, Lieutenant Henry finds the remains of Private Hayes. Hayes wasn't buried. He was stripped naked and his body abused by the Confederates. And so, by the way, this is not unusual. Shallow graves, half-buried dead, soldiers stripped naked. Soldiers on both sides did it during the war. And if you ever are looking for some broader context, Drew Gilpin Faust's splendid book, This Republic of Suffering, talks a lot about this. Again, not a happy book, but an important one. Well, as Lieutenant Henry was looking at Private Hayes' remains, he now had something additional to fight for. So this was not just a war for the preservation of the Union or a war to destroy slavery. This was a war to avenge the death and the treatment of Private Hayes. And he wrote his sister shortly after the battle, "The Confederates robbed my little dead boy. That scene motivated me to retaliate upon the live carcasses of live rebels." Well, that reaction is understandable. It's not unique. It's typical. It's a human reaction. So look, I am not going to stand here today, and I didn't write this in the book, and say that I'm naive and think that Cool Spring is the most important battle of the war. It's not. But Cool Spring, even though it is one of the war's lesser-known engagements, I think it offers a powerful reminder of a battle's importance and how we measure a battle's importance. Real quick story before I wrap this up. When Shenandoah University was gifted the Cool Spring, part of the Cool Spring battlefield by the American Battlefield Trust back in 2013, there was someone who came up to me and said, "I really don't know why Shenandoah even wants this, why the American Battlefield Trust would try to preserve this land. It's not Gettysburg. It wasn't this large engagement." And I looked at this person, and there are times where my filters don't work, but this time, luckily, they did. But I thought to myself, what a cold, heartless, and soulless thing to say. Because what that person was telling me is that unless you died at Gettysburg, Antietam, Chickamauga, or Shiloh, your life wasn't as valuable if you perished at Cool Spring. So I think when you are looking at the import of a Civil War battle, you can't just judge it by strength of armies engaged, total casualties suffered, or how it impacted the war's strategic outcomes or political outcomes. I think if you use only those metrics, I think it's wrong, I think it's immoral, and I think it's cold-hearted. So the Battle of Cool Spring, a battle that dominates the writings, post-war writings of veterans on both sides. I mean, there are soldiers in Robert Rhodes' division. So if you think about what Rhodes' men had been involved in by the summer of 1864, there are men in Rhodes' division basically saying, this is the hardest, sharpest, most obstinate affair in which I have ever been involved in at Cool Spring. This battle that inspires the poet Edith Thomas, a well-known poet in late 19th century America. The reports of the wounded being evacuated from the battlefield by Union soldiers. It inspired her in the 1880s to write a poem entitled A Christopher of the Shenandoah, Island Ford, Snickers Gap, July 18th, 1864. This poem, which is largely forgotten today, was actually a staple at Memorial Day ceremonies throughout the United States well into the early part of the 1900s. So you have a battle that dominates the writings of veterans. You have a battle that inspires a well-known poet of the period. I think all of this reminds us that Cool Spring derives its significance not from its outcome, because I told you what Assistant Secretary of War Charles Dana wrote after it. It achieved nothing militarily. But it derives its value from its multifarious impacts on soldiers and their families. Those personal consequences, coupled with the engagement's intense combat, it branded Cool Spring, at least in the estimation of Confederate veteran John Alexander Stikelether, a battle that deserved, as he wrote, never to be forgotten. So with that, I'm going to thank you all for listening and for tuning in online. You can do Q&A, right? Okay, so thank you.
So yes, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them now. And if you're online, please ask a question and we'll get that to Jonathan. A comment to sort of start things off. I love how you take this engagement and break it down in all these human interest stories and explain how this fight many people have never heard of, right, causes like a little pebble in a pond, ripples that last and go out into society for years and years after the war. I think that's fascinating. I love how you delivered that. So let's open it up to the floor for any questions that we might have. Yes, in the back.
Teresa Forsythe, Shenandoah, 1991.
Okay, good. Fellow Hornet.
A couple questions. How close was the battle to Holy Cross Monastery?
It's there.
That's what
Yep.
You might want to repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question was, for those online, how close is the Battle of Cool Spring to Holy Cross Abbey? So let me go back. This is probably the best photo. This property is owned by the Abbey. So there are easements on the property that preserve it in perpetuity. I believe the American Battlefield Trust has the easements on that property.
And Cool Springs is actually there at the...
That's at the Abbey side, yes. Mm-hmm.
And is there a golf course on the eastern side of the Shenandoah?
So question for those online, is there a golf course on the east side of the Shenandoah? There used to be. That's the property that's owned by the university now. So university, has walking trails. There's almost 2 miles worth of walking trails out there and signage and printed brochures. There's actually augmented reality experiences out there for visitors as well. And it's free of charge, although we will take donations. So, something great for a former Hornet.
You spoke a little bit about the men crossing the river back and forth. How do they get wagons and horses across?
So, question for those online is about crossing the river. How are they getting horses and wagons across? There is no rolling stock on that side of the river during the battle. In terms of horses, they're crossing them at Island Ford, which is, again, the river is really low. It's easy for them to get across. But the only guys really who are on horseback are officers. So we're probably talking maybe a few dozen at best. Any other questions?
Can
Yes.
you explain the title of the poem, Christopher?
Yes.
Does she already have a particular person named
No.
Christopher?
Great question. So question for those online, why is the poem entitled A Christopher of the Shenandoah? So let me tell you the story. So when I was working on this book, I actually stumbled across this in a newspaper. And I thought, well, this is interesting. And I, like you, thought, well, maybe she's referencing some person. Turns out that's not the case. So in the world of poetry, at this time, if you're using that term Christopher, it actually is a reference to Jesus Christ. So that the soldiers who are, rescuing and bringing them back over to the east side of the river, they are like these Christ-like figures, trying to save the lives of these men. Any other questions?
This is more of a generic question.
Uh-huh.
So how long did it take to assess the number of casualties? Like,
Oh, in the aftermath of battle?
I'm sorry?
In the aftermath of battle?
Right, and then, so you have a Union side trying to calculate how long would it take for them to find out what was lost on the other side?
So for those online, the question was basically how long does it take to know how many casualties are suffered, and then how long does it take the opposition to know how many casualties the enemy suffered. So in terms of like the Union Army, it doesn't take long at all, because in the aftermath of battle, and of course you have morning reports that are going to be filed, and you're going to have roll call, so you're going to kind of know how many men are missing, right? Now you won't know initially what the fate is if they're killed, wounded, or captured until days or weeks after the fact.
They could have deserted as well.
That's also possible, yes. And there are examples of that throughout the war. In terms of getting casualty figures of the opposition, it's difficult. And really what they're going to be relying upon a lot are newspapers. So if you think about, and newspapers were really critical and sometimes misleading sources of information for commanders on both sides. So I actually write about this in the book. When the Union Army was getting ready to leave Washington to pursue Jubal Early, Horatio Wright, Henry Halleck, Secretary of War Stanton, they had no idea how large the Confederate Army was. And so the prevailing number that shows up in a lot of DC newspapers and newspapers just outside of Washington is 40,000. Jubal Early had 15,000. And so that number gets inflated. So really, there's no free exchange of information between enemies, so you're really going to be getting that from newspapers from the other side. You think about this, right? So this also gives you an opportunity, if you're the enemy, to play mind games. Because you might want to downplay casualty totals and play up the casualty totals of others. And so this is something, just as a little aside, so I mentioned Drew Gilpin Faust's book, This Republic of Suffering. I don't know if you have it in the gift shop, maybe you do. So I'm trying to drum up some more sales for you, Dana. But one of the things that struck me in that book is how enemies would on purpose at times not bury the dead of the opposition in anything but a shallow grave, because they wanted it to, if the enemy ever, like Union soldiers in the case of Cool Spring, if they ever came across, they wanted to have a demoralizing psychological effect on the soldiers. And then they would take every effort to bury their own dead deeply or get them off the battlefield. So it looks like, wow, we suffered way more than they did. So hopefully that gives you some things to think about. Any other questions in the room or online? All right, thank you.
Well, big thanks to Professor Jonathan Noyles for this really fantastic talk. You're going to be sticking around for a few minutes in the gift shop to sign your book. If anyone would like a copy signed by the author, this is a great chance to pick it up. And again, I think a lot of what you told